All right. Well, it looks like we have a great group of people on so far. Thanks for taking the time to join our webinar today. My name is Maggie Bittner, and I'm the Events Manager at MDR, and I'll be your host. Today, we'll be talking about a very timely topic, the CARES Act, and specifically the funding it provides to the education sector. Before we get started, a few quick housekeeping notes. We have a large group of people, which is great, so we're going to keep everybody muted for the duration. Just want to do a quick sound check. Can you hear me? If not, please let me know through the chat button at the bottom of the screen. We're going to try to leave some time at the end for questions. So go ahead and type them into the Q&A box during the webinar, and we'll get to as many as we can. Some of them we might address as we're going through the slides as well. Also, we'll be recording the session, and we'll send it out to you in the next couple days with a link to both the recording and the slides. We have two great speakers with us who will really dive into this topic today. Maureen Hance brings over 20 years of experience to her role as Marketing Insights Product Manager for MDR. Her expertise in data, as well as email, digital, and social channels intersects as she oversees the market research and affinity modeling products. She also has been featured speaker at industry conferences, sales summits, and webinars. We also have Christina James, who will be joining us a little bit later as the marketing leader for MDR. She has nearly 20 years of marketing experience and has specifically been driving education marketing strategies since 2008. Christina regularly speaks on education marketing at industry conferences like South by Southwest, EDU, and EdNet. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to you, Maureen.
Great. Thanks, Maggie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Maggie said, we're here to talk about the CARES Act as it relates to education. So we'll start off with an overview of the CARES Act. We'll break it down into different phases and how this funding breaks out specifically for education. We'll also discuss the flow of CARES education funding and how schools can use it. I'll tell you about the new MDR Care Selects that we've developed that can help you target districts, schools, and higher education institutions by their estimated CARES allocations that they're applying for and receiving. We'll highlight areas of opportunity for your products and services. And lastly, we'll talk about some ideas for approaching your customers, given the opportunities and money that is available for schools, districts, and colleges. Next. So since the onset of the pandemic in the U.S., Congress has enacted 3 laws that together provide unprecedented financial support, roughly $3 trillion to the nation to address both immediate and long-term healthcare and economic impact of COVID-19. The first 2 bills that totaled about $1 trillion provided prevention, vaccine development, and Medicare treatment, as well as small business loans and social programs such as unemployment and food assistance. The third bill, which we'll be focusing on today, is referred to the CARES Act and includes over $2 trillion supporting direct payments to taxpayers, student borrowers, states, private industry, as well as the education segment. And there may be more coming. In phase 4, recent development on May 15th, the House of Representatives passed another $3 trillion package known as the HEROES Act. It provides another round of stimulus checks for individuals and proposes nearly $1 trillion in aid to states, cities, and local governments, and creates a $90 billion fund for K-12 schools and higher ed. However, according to the media, Democrats acknowledge that this is a huge proposal and is more a talking point than legislation that would be passed into law, since Republicans are calling for a pause on new aid for the time being. Next slide. So for our session today, we're focusing specifically on the CARES Act, the largest economic relief bill in the U.S. of over $2 trillion. It's often referred to as a stimulus package, but as Senator Mitch McConnell stated and reiterated that the COVID-19 impact on the economy requires more of emergency relief funding. So that's really kind of the context of this, is the emergency relief. This graphic depicts the breakdown of CARES funding allocations. You can see that individuals and big corporations are seeing the greatest chunk of relief in this bill, with over $500 billion each. Then small business, state and local governments with over $340 billion, with the education and related segments getting over $40 billion, or 2% of the total. So today, again, we're going to take a closer look at this pot of the money as it supports education, because as we all know, the pandemic has upended traditional teaching and learning in K-12 schools and higher ed. At least 50 million K-12 students and nearly 20 million college students were impacted as school buildings and campuses closed abruptly this spring, causing an unprecedented shift to online learning that will likely have a long-term impact on instruction even after the current crisis subsides. Therefore, a major thrust of the CARES funding for schools is to support this rapid shift to distance learning and to ensure that more schools and families are connected and accessing online curricula. Next slide. So as I said, CARES in Education allocates over $40 billion to the K-12 and higher ed institutions and programs for children. The bulk of this funding, $30 billion, is administered by the U.S. Department of Education through the Education Stabilization Fund. This fund is broken up into three buckets. The first one is the $13.5 billion in the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, otherwise known as ESSER. It's a formula-based program based on Title I, or the number of students who actually qualify for the free and reduced lunch program. It's intended to address immediate needs such as hardware and resources for distance education, ensuring student health and safety, and developing plans for the reopening of schools. The second bucket is $14 billion in the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, or HERE. It's also a formula grant based on the number of students receiving Pell or need-based grants. At least half of this funding must be used to provide emergency financial aid to students, and the rest can be used to cover institutional costs of shifting to online instruction. The third bucket is known as the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or GEER. This is also formula-based on student age and poverty levels, and it's up to the governor's discretion to decide how to distribute this funding among K-12 and higher ed institutions in their states. CARES, through the Department of Ed, provides additional support for clean and safe schools, as well as mental health initiatives through Project SERVE and BIA programs. Next slide. CARES adds over $8.5 billion to the Department of Agriculture's National School Lunch Program to ensure children receive meals while schools are closed. And the Department of Health and Human Services received over $4 billion to support pre-K and early childhood grants, as well as mental health and suicide prevention programs. Next slide. So now we're going to take a look at where we are today with regard to the CARES funding distributed by the U.S. Department of Ed, specifically that $30 billion bucket of education stabilization funds. On March 27th, the CARES Act was actually signed into law, and the Education Stabilization Fund was established. 2 weeks later, on April 9th, the first wave of funding was released, with over $6 billion in higher ed relief flowing to colleges for student financial aid to cover expenses like technology, course materials, housing, and childcare. Within 2 weeks, over half of higher ed institutions had applied for this funding, with $5.7 billion having been awarded to them to date. By the middle of April, $3 billion in the governor's relief fund was released, and each state's governor at this point has the discretion to distribute this funding as needed. States apply through a streamlined process, and at this time, almost $400 million has been awarded. On April 21st, an additional $6 billion in higher ed relief was made available to cover the institutional costs related to COVID-19, particularly those relating to distance learning. $3.8 billion has been awarded to colleges to date. That same week, $13.5 billion for elementary and secondary schools emergency relief was released. Currently, almost $9 billion has been awarded to 35 states, and we'll go over specific uses of ESSER funds in a minute. Just want to wrap up the month of April. The U.S. Department of Ed released the remaining funding for some competitive K-12 grants and an additional $1.4 billion in higher ed relief for minority colleges and universities. Next slide. So this graph represents the flow and timeline for the Elementary and Secondary Relief Fund, or ESSER fund. As I mentioned on the previous slide, states are applying and being awarded with their ESSER funding as we speak. At the same time, however, districts must apply to their states for their allocations, which again are based on the Title I formula. And this is what's happening right now. States have 1 year from the receipt of the funding from the U.S. Department of Ed to award to the districts. If not, the funds are returned to the Department of Ed for reallocation. Funding must be obligated or committed by states and districts by September of 2022. However, from the pace at which we see the states applying and are receiving their ESSER funding, it's very likely, and again, because the nature of this funding is emergency relief, the money will be spent much sooner than the deadline of September 2022. Next slide. So now we know funding is starting to flow, but how will schools spend these ESSER funds? The CARES Act includes a long list of allowable purchases, including any activities authorized under several existing federal education laws, such as the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act, which include programs like Title I, Title II, Title III, the IDEA Act, or Special Ed, and Perkins. Any products and services that address the unique needs of special populations, including low-income students, children with disabilities, English language learners, racial and ethnic minority students, all that is supported under the CARES funding. Also include our activities relating to responding to COVID-19, including resources for keeping schools clean and minimizing infection, for improving preparedness and response efforts, as well as staff training. ESSER also supports planning and coordinating long-term closures with distance learning technology. This applies to all hardware, one-on-one devices, instructional content, professional development. It also includes implementing summer learning and after-school programs that could bring students up to speed, as well as other activities to maintain operations and reopen the schools. So there's a great deal of funding and flexibility in how schools can use their ESSER funds. And now is the time for schools to make the shift to online and hybrid learning by thinking broadly and coordinating plans and resources. Next slide. So now I'll share some insights about MDR's analysis of the elementary and higher ed relief allocations to districts, schools, and colleges. MDR develops selections to the education database based on the ESSER and the HERE funding. These selections can help you target K-12 schools and colleges by their estimated amount of CARES allocations that can be used to purchase your products and services. Next slide. So we'll take a look at the K-12 CARES District Allocation Select first. It is based on the available $13 billion of ESSER funding. It identifies over 12,000 districts and schools reporting to them by the district level estimated CARES allocation range. We created 4 ranges for the selection. You can see them on the right in the bar chart. About 2/3 of the districts are estimated to get less than $400,000, while about 1/3 may get $400,000 or more, with about 10% of districts getting over $1.5 million. These estimated ranges were calculated based on the district's actual Title I dollar allocation and a formula outlined in the CARES Act. Next slide. We'll take a deeper dive into the ranges by district size. While most of the small districts, and those are districts with under 2,500 students, are in the lower ranges, about 15% of them fall into the higher buckets of 400,000 or more. About 70% of medium districts, those are districts with 2,500 to 10,000 students, fall in the higher ranges, 400,000 or more, while almost all of the large districts, and those have 10,000 or more students, fall into the highest range of $1.5 million or more. Next slide. Here's a look at the allocation ranges by metropolitan classification. More than half of the urban districts, in the dark blue, fall into the highest allocation range of 1.5 million or more, while about 15% of the suburban districts and 10% of rural and town combined are in the highest allocation category. Next slide. Now we'll look at the higher ed CARES Select, which is based on the $6 billion of the higher ed relief fund that's available for colleges to spend on those building institutional level products. This does not include the emergency student financial aid. It's purely just that piece that buildings can spend. We obtained a file of higher ed institutions and their CARES estimates from the U.S. Department of Education and matched it to MDR's college file, which resulted in over 3,500 colleges and universities, including 2- and 4-year universities, colleges, and universities with graduate schools, as well as some career and trade institutions. We created 5 ranges that you can select from, and you can see them on the chart to the right. Next slide. So this slide shows the higher ed relief allocation range by institution type. Of the total 3,500 institutions receiving higher ed relief, 70% are 2-year community colleges and 4-year universities with graduate programs. So those are much larger state universities. Over 1/3 of community colleges in the red are allocated between $1 and $3 million, while almost 1/4 of the 4-year universities with graduate level programs are allocated the highest range of $3 million or more. Okay, next slide, please. I will just wrap up with mentioning in tracking CARES funding, we've observed several opportunities for our industry partners. Next slide. As we all have come to realize, the overarching purpose of CARES is to improve schools and colleges' ability to deliver instruction remotely, even after the pandemic subsides. We know and we've learned that resources that support distance learning are in great demand, such as telecommunications, hardware, collaborative team software, and instructional content. Existing federal resources can be applied for technology and training on distance learning through programs like Title I and Title II. So there's even additional funding that's available to put forth. The digital divide has also further exposed the needs for connectivity and devices in low socioeconomic and rural areas, and digital content for special populations like English language learners and special ed is also in great demand. Next slide. We also learned that teachers need more training than ever for teaching remotely, adapting content, and using collaborative tools as they gear up to plan for reopening in the fall. Mental health and SEL, social emotional learning supports, are also well funded in CARES. Finally, as schools plan to reopen, they need to provide safe and healthy setting for students and staff. So they will be looking to purchase sanitizing, cleaning products, PPE, and other equipment and training that will help to minimize infection. So just to wrap up, as I mentioned earlier, Congress is considering additional stimulus measures in the coming weeks, and we'll certainly be tracking that as well as the use of those funds. I'd like to pass the controls now to Christina to share some ideas for approaching your customers, given the opportunities and money that's available. Christina?
Hi. Thanks, Maureen. Hi, everyone. I appreciate, Maureen, the analysis and insights into some of the opportunities for those listening on the phone. You know, over the last 6 to 8 weeks, as sellers and marketers, collectively, we've all been trying to figure out how to stay in touch, how to help our customers and our partners without saying the wrong thing, appearing insensitive, or even being overly salesy. MDR, we've written blogs about tone and offering the right solutions during a time when our traditional wisdom seems to go out the window. So now that we know, though, that there are actually opportunities and, more importantly, money available to school districts, let's talk about some ideas for approaching our customers. So, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe traditional wisdom doesn't totally have to go out the window, though. Maybe we just need to tweak it for right now. As marketers, we always talk about choosing the right message for the right audience and delivering it in the right place, and more importantly, at the right time. So following that mantra and thinking about the CARES funding distribution and how educators can leverage what you have to offer today and in a couple of months, we should be thinking about, do we have what they can use or what they need to solve their challenges, or does what we have, can we tweak that to help meet these challenges? And then tell educators about what we have in the places that they are today, which obviously is not the school building. Many schools still don't know what the next school year will look like as we close out this school year and look towards the next. However, from what we know about CARES, we do know that schools have money to buy right now. And through the CARES funding timeline, although it seems long, the truth is that states are looking to districts right now, and districts are looking to principals today. And principals, in turn, are talking to their teachers about the experiences that they've had over the last few weeks and months to determine what they should be asking for, what they should be spending money on. We recently surveyed 2,000 teachers and administrators and asked them just that. What are their challenges and what are their areas of need? Where do they need the most support? And here's a recap of what they said. When asked the greatest challenge to the shift to distance learning, some of the top responses that came up were lack of remote learning training, lack of remote learning technology, and lack of remote learning resources. Devices for students was also a major challenge, and home connectivity for students as well. When we specifically asked what are the best ways for education companies like you to support, and what other tools or resources would be useful, they said, again, training and how to best teach remotely and engage students, remote learning technology, engaging online resources, more devices, and the opportunity to connect with other teachers virtually to share best practices. Just going to show you a couple of slides here on the percentages related to the items that I just listed off. And at the end of the presentation, there's a link to the full survey and all the questions that we asked and their results. So knowing that teachers have challenges, administrators have challenges and needs, and specifically what those are, you should be thinking about your ideal customer and who that person is right now and in a few months from now. Your audience should always change depending on factors like customer needs, time of year, budget, and current environment. So use what you know about past engagement and purchases to begin to identify the best person right now. And even consider those you may not have talked to in the past by using data points like the CARES and other funding, including grants, size of school and district, the metro and geography, location, enrollment. Leverage your lookalikes. Use modeling to identify who might have the highest propensity to buy right now based on some of the selects that Maureen reviewed. Who has been buying from you? Who's been buying during these last few months? Who's bought historically? Consider influencers. We've been talking about influencer marketing for a while now, but more now than ever are we hearing opinions from parents because they're even more informed since they've been asked to implement distance learning and help their students. So think about the members of the school board, think about the PTAs, and think about the fact that they have influence on how this funding is being spent and what the next school year will look like. And then once you know who your best target is, determine how you can get in touch with them. And since school buildings are closed, we need to think digitally. So from an email perspective, who do you have on file? And can you get more of their email? Phone numbers even. Our data team has been calling schools and districts to get updates on school closures and openings. And we are seeing that many schools and districts actually are rerouting their phone numbers so that people can answer at home. Custom audiences. Through social media, you can match the data you have or the data that we have to try and reach people both through social channels and through websites. Online is the right channel right now. Teachers are online more than they have traditionally. Year over year, we're seeing increases, and not just from the same time last year, but at the end of 2019 and even earlier in 2020. And our current email response rates, social ad impressions, and page views on our weareteachers.com community demonstrates that not only are teachers online more than ever, they're responding to and reacting to relevant content. Because, as they told us, they need support. They're looking for support, and they're turning online. So help educators decide which products they should use to meet their needs and solve their challenges today. Because we believe that by this time next year, based on the timeline that Maureen shared, states will have spent the funds as they will not want to return any unused dollars. Helping schools in this environment is sharing with them the products and services you have. While school buildings are closed, you need to do this digitally, and you need to do it now while they're evaluating and making decisions about CARES dollars and about what our next school year will look like. So thank you for joining our webinar. I'm going to turn it back to Maggie, where we will, I think, be able to answer some questions based on the time we have left. I think Maggie was going through the Q&A, and here you will get this deck, but here is a list of resources. I mentioned some of the blog posts on tone. I talked about the teacher survey and the more details on the breakout of CARES funding. You can go back and look into it deeper. Maggie?
All right. Well, thank you so much, both Maureen and Christina, for your expertise. We do have a lot of questions, so I am going to throw out a few. I'm not sure that we'll be able to get through them all. So if you've submitted through the Q&A tool, That's something that we'll be able to download and get back to you afterwards. So that's the best way for us to keep track and make sure we get everybody answered. But for right now, I'm just going to throw out a couple of them and hopefully get through them. So one, is the ESSER funding in addition to the Title I funds for each district?
Yeah, I could take that one. Yes, it is. It is. You could almost look at it like another round of Title I distribution for the school year. It is definitely on top of the current Title I allocations the school and districts are receiving.
All right, thank you. We've gotten some questions about reopening. Is there anything you can share about what you know about that?
Sure, I can answer
Yep.
that. This is Christina. Yeah, we are tracking the reopening of schools. We know that state by state, they are making decisions. What we're seeing first in some states is actually the reopening of daycares and libraries. So the educational space is expanding. Additionally, we're hearing about schools implementing summer programs and going back to school early. We do, on the screen we have up, we do have a list of school closings, and that will be updated with school openings as well. And when we say school openings, that's not just the school building itself opening, but school returning to back in session.
Thank you. Another question. Are districts required to provide info on how they'll be spending the money?
There is, as far as I understand it, this is Maureen, there is a short form or application that they do have to submit to their state departments. So yeah, they do have to outline, a plan for how they will intend to spend the money, as far as I know.
Great.
But again, it's very flexible in terms of the spending. And as I said, I think it's a really important time that they take the time to think and coordinate, because there is a lot of money out there that they can put together to really put together a solid plan.
Great. Will districts have the flexibility with CARES funds to purchase physical books like library books and other physical supplemental materials in the K-12 market?
Yes, I would say yes to that, because those are products and services that are supported currently under existing education law. So yeah, it's not just for technology. Certainly supplemental would be supported.
Great. I'm just going to reiterate one more time because it keeps coming up. We are going to be sharing both the recording of the audio from this as well as the slide deck. That way everybody has both. There's a lot of questions here about specific data, and that is something that we're going to have to go through one by one and get back to individually. Just in the interest of time and resources that we have on the phone right now. Another question is any of the funding going to private schools?
That is a great question. And I'll take a stab at it, but there's a lot of confusion and contention out there right now that the U.S. Department of Ed is considering. I guess the initial guidance was that the districts were to share some of the funding with the private schools, but it was an issue of how they count the students, whether is it applicable to private school Title I students, or is it for all students that are attending private schools. So within the next couple of weeks, the U.S. Department of Ed is coming out with definitive guidance on that. But yes, private schools can receive or will receive a portion of a district's funding. It's just a matter of how much, and that is being worked out right now. So I would stay tuned to the U.S. Department of Ed website for their final decision on that.
Okay, thank you. Another one is, we're just going to do one or two more. In the interest of time, I know that everybody, is back to back online all day long. So just want to be respectful of that. Is there a list of links that we can send to schools so they can apply for grants?
Sure, I can answer that. MDR has a product called Market View. If you go to mdreducation.com, there's a link on our homepage, and you can access that product at no cost. But within the product, and it is for a fee, there is a grants and funding section. So you can review all grants and funding that is available to schools and school districts, and certainly share that information with schools. It also indicates which schools and districts were awarded those grants.
Okay. Let's see. Sorry. Some of these questions are really long, and I'm trying to read through them.
I see a question, Maggie, about,
okay.
Do you think that using the CARES funding as a main headline attention getter is insensitive or appropriate? We think it's appropriate. We've been talking a lot about, obviously, the CARES funding and how it can be used. And it's not entirely clear, to be honest, if schools completely understand what funds are available or how they can use the funds, similar to the, what grants are available question. So I think that some of the resources we have on our website would be good for you guys to share with customers and let them know how they can leverage these dollars and for what products. I worked for Pearson years ago, and we had a team of people that did just that, which is understood the funding and worked directly with schools and districts with our products to try and help them understand what dollars can be used. As I said earlier, teachers and administrators know that there are things they need, and they're telling us what those needs are, and most of those things can be paid for by the CARES funding. So I think as a good partner, it's not insensitive. It's definitely appropriate to talk to them about the money that's available to them and how they can leverage it.
All right. Thank you, Christina. And once again, thank you, Maureen. I am going to wrap it up at this point in time. We do have a lot of other questions. We are going to call through them, get back to you either individually and also follow up with an email. The email, again, will include additional information plus links to both the slide deck and the recording. Really appreciate your time attending. And if you need anything else, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. Take care. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.